district and work with USMB youth on networking and trying to get everybody hopefully more connected. So if you're interested in connecting more with other youth workers from around the USMB conference, just let me know. I would love to help get you connected wherever I can, and I'm excited about that. So that's good for now. Kyle, why don't you take it away and let's jump in.
Okay, so I'm gonna share the screen, and so hopefully be able to see everything. All right, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right.
I'll jump in here too and say that as you guys have questions or comments or anything, just use the chat. I'll try monitoring that as Kyle goes as well.
Yep. And then for most of you, you can just kind of mute your mic. And then if you have any questions, you can unmute it and then talk. I can't see you. For the most part, I can see some of you. But if you have a question, put it in the chat or just interrupt me. That's no big deal. I work with teenagers, so I get interrupted all the time. For those of you who don't know, my name is Kyle Goings. I'm currently in Wichita, Kansas. I'm the student ministry pastor at USMB Church. I've been here for about 5 years. And we've kind of gone through some changes as our church. And about my quick story is 3 years ago, I noticed a lot of my high school students were graduating into college and weren't really sticking around the church. And I'm sure you kind of experienced that. So I was trying to figure out, okay, what do I do? Why is that the case? And so I started basically taking out some college students out to lunch. And now that they're in college, they were looking for something else. They weren't rebelling and kind of getting rid of the church. They were just looking for something more and something different. So that started a journey of reading a lot of different books. These are some of the books I definitely recommend. If you haven't read any of them, that's okay. But I probably have read 20 different books on just different generations, websites, YouTube pages, all kinds of that. Not saying that I'm an expert in any way, but more, I really wanted to discover what's so different about these two generations. And so Millennials and Gen Z are the two that we're going to kind of focus on, and I'll explain why in a bit. Like Russ said, you can leave a comment in the chat if you have any questions, or email me if it's maybe a more complex question. So how do we get started? Before we get started, I'm hearing some feedback. Is everyone else hearing feedback? Like talking or not? Okay.
Yes.
If you're on, go ahead and mute your mic. It's in the bottom left-hand corner if you can. Because I don't want to make sure I'm, if someone has a question, I can hear them too. So go ahead and mute them if you can. But
Kyle, this is Tim. I think you have the power to mute everyone down under the participants. If you click if you're the host, I think you have the power to mute everyone.
I'm not the host. That's the problem.
Oh, okay. Well, whoever the host is could probably potentially be that. Okay.
Laura, if you're still on, it'd be nice if you could help us out. Oh, I think we did. Okay. So when we're speaking about generations, we're speaking of generalities. And here's why. No one wants to be labeled and put in a box. And so if I say a characteristic for one generation and that doesn't necessarily fit you or people you know, that's because we're speaking in generalities of that. And so we're talking about millions of people, and these are themes throughout this. So we could spend the next 10 minutes or even the next hour on this chart alone, so I'm not going to do that. But if you kind of want to know generations, here's a couple of things that I've discovered. One, the age group and when generations start and stop is drastically different from researcher to researcher. So generally speaking, I move towards the unique influence, as in something happened in this generation to define it, rather than every 20 years is a new generation. So that's why some is a little different. It goes clear back to the silent generation. The greatest generation is before that, but they're 74 to 91. Baby boomers are 55 years old to 73. Gen X, 40-year-olds to 54-year-olds. Millennials, or Y, Gen Y, is 24 to 39-year-olds. And Gen Z is 5 years old all the way up to 23 years old. So they're now reaching post-college. As you can see, they've kind of clearly been influenced by big things. So baby boomers was the sexual revolution, even up into the 1950s, consumer economy, Watergate and JFK and Martin Luther King assassinations had a mistrust of authority figures in government, and that drastically shaped who they are in this. Gen X's were the kind of the leftovers, if you will. They felt overlooked, and they're kind of the baby busters. But they grew up in MTV and the Cold War, AIDS crisis. That was a huge decade, the 80s, for them in their influence. And then you have a switch to Gen Y, which is 9/11, War on Terror, Great Recession. The internet started in this time, but Gen Z really took it to the next level with mobile tech, YouTube, social media, all that. So Gen Z is an interesting one. It is the one generation that does not have a terrible negative event to define that generation. Before, it was a crisis, it was Watergate, it was a war, it was 9/11. But Gen Z actually grew up in a very peaceful time, figuratively speaking, worldwide. And so that drastically shaped their identity in this. The one thing that's probably negative is they probably felt or experienced a Great Recession from their older maybe brothers and sisters, but that's not really them in how that shaped that. So as you can see, the sense of identity goes all the way from I am humble to I am fluid in this. Gen Y is I am awesome. So here's the thing. There'll be some jokes and all that, and it's easy to make jokes on millennials, and you probably all heard them, all of that. But when we kind of think of generations, what we need to think of is they're all on the same track. And the characteristics of a current generation is what the previous generation really wanted to be, but didn't do it, or didn't have enough time, or couldn't do it, or for whatever reason. So if you think about it, we only have ourselves to blame if we're unhappy with the younger generation, because the baby boomers raised the millennials, in generally speaking, and Gen Xers raised Gen Z, which is a big reason why these two generations, although similar, are vastly different in their view of the future. If you don't know, if you look all the way at the bottom, view of the future. So YOLO means you live only once. That's Gen Y. And then FOMO is fear of missing out. So you live only once means experience everything quickly as possible. And FOMO means you need to be connected and up to date on everything. So you're constantly looking at news and social media and the latest trends, because you don't want to miss out on that. So that's kind of the generations. If you're looking at a percentage right now in the United States, just in 2016, because that's the latest census, almost 50% make up two generations. So that it's not like a smaller group of people. It's 50%, and it will be way higher when the 2020 census gets completed. So the reason why I say that is currently there's a mindset I'm seeing in the church, and I've been involved in multiple churches and looking through some research, just doing some interviews. Currently, the church is kind of designed and led by and run by the greatest generation, the silent, the baby boomers, Gen X. Although those are different generations, that's what the church kind of makes up. The future of the church, 100% the future of the church, is millennials and Gen Z, but they're radically different in philosophy, in methods, in their opinions, in how they communicate. And so what's happening is there's a bigger and bigger gap happening between the church and these two generations. And it's one of the reasons why they're just not in the church, generally speaking. So we know this if you are kind of part of the 10-2 movement, where you're praying every day at 10:02 in the morning. Luke 10:2 is the harvest is great, but the workers are few. So pray to the Lord who is in charge of the harvest, and ask him to send more workers into his fields. So think about it this way, and don't take this illustration too far, because it works just in a small setting. But the church is kind of like, a farmer harvesting, and the people are the crop. And even though we're one church, there's churches a little bit different. Maybe one church focuses more on corn, another church on soybeans. And so you have a little bit of difference in maybe equipment, maybe the type of year you harvest, but overall, it's pretty much the same overlapping, generally speaking, way of harvesting. That church has been doing that for many years. Now, because these two generations are so drastically different and further along on the track, we need to treat them more like harvesting grapes. I've never harvested grapes personally, but from what I see, it's drastically different than harvesting any other type. You have to have more of a relationship with them. They have to be more in years in development. They have to be way more delicate in how they handle it. Where you harvest is a big factor, things like that. And so Pastor Brent Workington, he always would say, this is a crop we haven't faced before. And so maybe a different way of harvesting needs to be tackled. So how do you continue harvesting for your people already in your church, and then new harvest? What does that look like? So before we can kind of get into what does that look like, today is very heavy data oriented, just because I'm a data person, and this week is all about sharing about what these generations are and what the church could do. Next week, we're going to dive way deeper into being a little bit more practical, giving advice, and love to hear some ideas that other churches are already doing. But before we get into that, we need to understand that the millennials are a unique generation because it's the only generation known that actually has split into two different generations in the same one. So the me millennials are the typical, what people joke about, entitled, lazy, overly idealistic. These are the ones that people make funny jokes about, all that. But there's actually another, and it's split almost 50-50, called mega millennials. And these are the ones that are overlooked. These are the millennials that are doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're getting a job right out of college. They have a college degree. They didn't change their major 20 times. They have a family. They're going to church. And what's happening is the mega millennials are resenting the me millennials. And a lot of times you see in the news or something like that where they're insulting them or angry at them. That's usually the mega millennials insulting their own generation because they resent on that. So we're going to be talking about both of them, but I wanted you to know that it's not all the same thing when it comes to millennials. Okay, so let's dive in here. So right now, these two generations, there's some big differences that affect both of them. There's some overlapping things as well, but the big thing is millennials grew up in this economic boom. Things were good in the United States. There's not a lot of data outside the United States because culture is so drastically different. So I'm just speaking about the United States. Gen Z, though, however, grew up in the Great Recession. So their view of the world, their view of money and things like that is drastically different. In fact, the biggest difference is millennials are idealistic. It's going to work out. Things are great. Let's try this. Let's give up my good paying job because I could get a job that makes a bigger impact on the world, even though it might be less money. However, Gen Z is very pragmatic, very realist. They're going to focus more, millennials, on experiences. Gen Z is focusing more on saving money. So millennials, the vacation market just skyrocketed the past 20 years of going on cruises and spending their money, not saving up, not buying the biggest house, but staying in an apartment and then actually going and experiencing trips. So vacations, especially vacations that you take really good Instagram pictures on, is really good. Gen Z, they're not doing much of anything. They can experience the world through their phones, so they're going to save up and they're going to get a job, but really save up money. They don't know what they're saving their money for, but they just need to have that security. As you can see, Facebook and Instagram is millennials, Snapchat and Instagram. So Instagram is a social media platform that overlaps between these two. A lot of business and brands and economic kind of selling items on Instagram is a big business for these two things as well. Okay, so let's kind of have a little bit of showdown on this. So role models, and generally speaking, Kanye West, Michael Phelps, he's an Olympian, an actress for millennials. Katniss Everdeen, if you don't know who that is, that's not a real person. That is a character in the Hunger Games. And the Hunger Games is actually a great example of Gen Z culture. It's grit. the world is coming to an end, or the world has basically already been destroyed, and only themselves, they can only depend on themselves to get themselves out of it. PewDiePie has about 140 million views on YouTube, or he used to, and he's a very popular gamer, and he literally gets money or gets paid to play games and film himself doing that. So stereotype they're sick of hearing. Millennials entitled, need coddling. Gen Z is all about technology. Learn to swipe on a screen before they learn to speak, which is technically true in some situations. What both of these have in common is both generations are the most educated generation than any before. And Gen Z took the crown from the millennials only because the millennials took the crown from Gen X and so forth. So 1 and 2, they will say will have some kind of bachelor's degree or trade school degree by the time they're mid-20s. Work style, and we'll get into that more in a bit. Millennials are collaborative. It has to do with people. Let's work together. Bosses and employees are all together in the same room working on the same project together. Gen Z is competitive. They need people, but only to compete against, not necessarily to work with. Never heard of floppy disk, millennials. Sorry, it's just true. But Gen Z, flip phones. That shows how far the technology has come, that Gen Z is like, why would you not have a phone that you can't access the internet or Facebook or Snapchat on? Source of stress, choice overload. That was a fascinating thing to kind of discover. Millennials kind of get overwhelmed with choice overload. That's one of the reasons why a lot of restaurants are shrinking their menu rather than expanding it. And churches, if you have a bulletin that has 20 different things that a person could do in the bulletin, that's kind of overwhelming to millennials. Gen Z, if you have even a reminder of, hey, shut off your cell phones, silent your cell phones, don't bring them to church, now you're causing anxiety or stress at Gen Z. So if you do those two things, that's probably the biggest source of stress. Not saying it's right, it just is reality in that. So future desire, millennials want to be discovered. They want that recognition, popularity, number of followers on social media or YouTube. Gen Z, though, they want to be known to being a hard worker, but successful, but on their own merits, that they did it themselves. So work culture has drastically changed between these two generations. And I do think this could impact and does impact the church and Gen Z and millennials' involvement in the church. So like millennials want to make they could care less about the paycheck. They want to have a purpose. Gen Z, they're actually looking for money and job security. So they're not going to go to camps or events if it costs a certain amount, if they don't see the value of that. They still want to make a difference, but it's job security and money is more important. They want to be coached.
Kyle, let me jump in real quick.
Go ahead.
The question came up, are these stats and is this research relative to all of North America or just the United States? What would you say to that?
I would say that's a good question. I would say majority of them would be in the United States. I haven't seen a lot of research for maybe Canada or Mexico or stuff like that. So I would say majority, but I do think there's a lot of overlap in other countries. That's how I would answer that, if that makes sense. Thanks, Russ, for interrupting me. That helps me out because I can't see the chat feature. So it's again, collaborative versus competitive. And what they're saying is the average millennial will change jobs 13 times and Gen Z 17 times. Here's what that means. They're most likely not going to stay at the same church either in their lifetime because they're going to move towards their job. So it's going to be way more fluid. So being a member of a church because you're here for a job for 5 years is a less and less of a value to them. Okay. So Gen Z, let's talk a little bit about Gen Z, partly because I want to kind of get over the stereotype that, oh, they're just kids and they're just babies. The oldest ones are now out of college and they're looking for a church. They're maybe they're church planters. They may be your youth pastor who you've hired if you work in a church. So this is, again, the result of continual generational growth. So some things that Gen Z does is millennial wants to do or leading towards that, they just aged out of that. Emery Wright, he wrote a book called Meet Generation Z, and it's kind of one of the first ones in the Christian culture doing, it's several years old now, but about Gen Z. So it's a good book, but some of the data has even expanded or gone outside of his book already. But he says Gen Z will be the most religious force in the West and the heart of the missional challenge facing the church. Again, these two generations will be 100% of the church in the future. They might not be it right now. So the big thing is they're digital natives. What that basically means is they grew up in this. They don't know a life without technology. Millennials are tech savvy. They learn that technology, but they didn't grow up in it. So it's not as ingrained. Millennials actually have a harder time being addicted to social media and all that. What they're noticing with Gen Z is that they only have 1 or 2, maybe 3 social media accounts, but they only focus on 1 or 2. They're not overload like millennials who didn't really have the boundaries to say no. They have all the accounts. So they grew up in a world of social media and Wi-Fi. That's how they think. That's how they communicate. There's a great documentary called Screenagers, which I think is a perfect nickname to Gen Z. It's a doctor, and you can find it online. I think it costs, you can rent it for a little bit. And they're coming out with a second one this year. But she basically did some research on how does it affect the teenager's brain with screens. So they communicate with their smartphones, laptops, tablets, and face-to-face. But as you can see, a lot of the communication is digital. Jack Dorsey, he's a generation researcher. He says technology is only new if you remember the way it was before. So if we treat phones and social media and technology as new technology, it's not. It's only new technology to us, not necessarily to them. So there's a disconnect there. If you're just wondering what apps Gen Z is using, these are the top 4 apps. TikTok is exploding. If you have no idea what that is, don't worry about it, but it's basically a music video sharing app, and it will surpass Facebook and Snapchat within the next 2 years, they're saying. That's projection. Again, it's all projection. Some of the things that you need to be aware of with Gen Z is 69% use the internet for the school. So separating them, like having a life offline and online, doesn't exist for Gen Z. It's all together. There is no offline life. It's online and offline. There's no separation to that because they need it for school. They need it for shopping. 92% spend 6 to 9 hours a day absorbing some kind of media. Netflix, YouTube, something like that. 6 to 9 hours a day. They spend sometimes more time doing that than going to school. Downside is a majority of them will see some kind of pornography kind of thing before they're 18, and they're heavily into games. Gaming is actually going to be an increase, and it's going to be kind of the new wave. Like social media was a wave 10 years ago. Gaming is going to that. In fact, esports, electronic sports, will be the second most popular sports by the end of 2021. They're projecting more. Only football will beat that. So they're extremely diverse. 50% of all kids under 5 in the United States are now ethnic minorities in some way. Women have a huge role in media. So women are the superheroes. They're the directors now. They're not paraded around, but they're highlighted by being a woman director. It's a huge, important aspect, particularly in the media. They're friends with a variety of ethnicities. Before, you're kind of in your own little group or your own little neighborhood, but now with social media, they're connected to a wide variety of people. 1 in 6 marriages are interracial couples. They're also justed-minded. Basically, they grew up post 9/11, so they don't have any experience in 9/11, but they do have experience of the war in Iraq and terrorist attacks and mass shootings. And so they know the world is dangerous. You don't have to convince them of that, and they actually live through that in a different way. But they want to make an impact and are actually very generous givers to charitable organizations that they feel make a genuine impact. So just giving to the church because you're supposed to is not an idea or a drive or a value. It's more, okay, I want to give to the church because the church is doing this in the world. If you don't know who this guy is, and you want to know Gen Z. This guy's named Mr. Beast. He has a YouTube account. He is the stereotypical Gen Z person. Watch his videos and you'll see exactly who Gen Z is. He doesn't claim this to be. He's just popular. So he's one of the most popular subscribed YouTubers, and he's making millions of dollars through his clothing brand and his YouTube channel. So he just did 20 million subscribers, as in people literally subscribe to his channel. Hundreds of millions watch it. So in the response, he planted with other YouTubers 20 million trees. He took money, and normally he's not rich, living in a rich house or anything like that. He takes his money and he spends it on like good, positive stuff. Now, I don't know if he's a Christian or not. His videos are not inappropriate, but they're definitely not with a Christian message. But it's just a stereotypical. They want to make a positive impact, but they're going to choose what's an impact. They're hopeful generation, but realistic in their mindsets. Okay. Another one is they're independent. They want to be independent. They don't want to be like millennials. So lumping them together is a great insult to millennials. No offense to millennials, but that's just their thing. They grew up in the Great Recession. So here's a pro of being independent. They're very self-directed and confident, entrepreneurial in their mindset. The con, though, is they're not necessarily equipped with much real life wisdom, partly because their age and their ability to not really to learn through a system. They want to learn on their own and haven't created many boundaries. So here's the problem. The boundaries have kind of not gone very well, and as a result, the dangers have increased. Suicide is now the second leading cause of death for teenagers outside of car accidents, and cyberbullying is up. Porn is up. Hooking up, as in sex outside of marriage, hacking, scams, identity theft. They're sharing more information online than they should, partly because they haven't really had a parent or their parents teach them digital boundaries in that, because parents didn't know about all the digital options out there. So let's talk about communication. Here's a quick little video. It's from a YouTube channel called Sunday Cool. He does all kinds of fun videos, but this is a different way of how Generation Z speak.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Carl. So it seems like every other week, the kiddos of Generation Z seem to come out with new slang terms that, quite frankly, confuse the rest of us older generations. So the goal today is to learn how to speak some of that Gen Z lingo. And joining me today on how to translate some phrases is our favorite spokesperson for the Gen Z kids, my cousin Brock. Say hello, Brock. Brock, say hello.
Stop.
All right, let's get started.
You guys have the Wi-Fi password?
All right, Brock, we're going to start with some simple ones.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, how are you?
Saw.
Friends, fam, family, fam jam. It was a fun event. The fest was lit. Okay. I'm about to leave. I'm finna dip set. Those are some neat shoes. Them kicks are dripping. I would be glad to help. But my favorite team lost. Dudes took an L. My favorite team lost very bad. Dudes got clapped. He seems upset. He little mad. He seems very upset. He big mad. I like this music. That's a bop. I'm not lying. No cap. I'm sorry that happened to you. Oof. That's an interesting statement. Weird flex, but okay. I'm not a fan of these appetizers. These apps are booty. I completely agree with that statement. Facts. I agree. Yeet, yeet. Excuse me. Yeet. Wow, that's exciting news. Yeet. Congratulations on your baby boy. Yeet. What does yeet even mean? Yeet is yeet. That doesn't help. It's like when fam comes slipping in with their dripping swag, jamming to some sick bop. And no cap, you know these facts are about to be litty fresh to death. You're like, oh, I'm not big mad at that booty response. Yeet. I don't get it. Weird flex, but okay. I don't know.
Okay. So if you had no idea what they were saying, don't be alarmed. That's what most people, including myself, are struggling with. With technology, the trends and things are going viral faster and faster. So language is changing on a much faster rate. And so what could be popular now, 6 months later, is totally different. And so the language of how Gen Z communicates, they're not all that bad. That's kind of the worst example, but I love the video. But there are words that literally have no meaning, that it's expressing an emotion. So we're living in a new world. So this is millennials and Gen Z. Now, again, millennials are just not as far along on this track. So that's why I'm focusing on Gen Z. But these are the things that both millennials and Gen Z are living for. So I need to set up the world before we do our last thing. So truth is relative. This is not a discussion to Gen Z. It's still somewhat a discussion for millennials, but right and wrong is determined by the individual and by society. That's the biggest factor that changes everything of how the church operates, is that truth is relative, and arguing any other way is kind of futile to Gen Z. Like, that's a fact to them, which is weird because it's kind of like an absolute, but it's not. So we'll get into that in a moment. Here's what that means. If the truth is relative, the Bible is no longer authority, as in, it doesn't mean it's not authority to us or to people who grew up in the church. It basically means the Bible told me so is not a phrase that brings any more weight. Andy Stanley wrote a book called Irresistible, and it kind of explains this a little bit further. But this saying the Bible told so, or here, the Bible says this, or giving the reference, doesn't actually give more weight to this statement, to that, partly because truth is relative. Gender and sexuality is fluid. If truth is relative, gender and sexuality is directly tied to truth, and that's going to be fluid as well. So in the past, identity always was found as what we like, who we are attracted to, is now what we like. In the past, it was where we come from. So our family was a big identity factor in our gender, in our identity, in our sexuality. Our heritage, maybe it's we're Italian, or even a denomination, we're Methodist, or we're Mennonite Brethren. That affected our identity and affected our gender and sexuality. But now it's all about choice. What we like to do, who do we like we hang out with, who we are attracted to, or we think we're attracted to, that changes our identity. 82% say they don't care about sexual orientation. That's what Gen Z says. Like, it doesn't matter. They can be whoever they want to be. So that's a huge thing when we're talking about relationship series and dating series and a big chunk of the Bible. They live in a post-Christian culture with little to no acquaintance with the gospel. If they know of Jesus, it's because what they probably heard, but don't really fully understand who Jesus is. 37% believe believe it is not possible to know for God for sure. So they don't know if God is real for sure. 37%, we don't know if that ever is possible to even do that. 4 in 10, though, do attend a religious service at least twice a month. So 2 out of the 4 times a month, you have a regular attender for Gen Z. And that's 40% on that. So let's break that down in that post-Christian culture. So these are the 2 phrases you'll need to know. Barna, I think, invented them, but basically what you need to know is nuns and duns. Nuns are people who have no religious affiliation whatsoever. Duns are people who used to have a religious affiliation, but are done with that religion, okay? So here's millennials. Millennials, statistics show that 39% have no religious affiliation whatsoever, not Christian, Buddha, any religion whatsoever, almost 40%. Of that 40%, 60 came from the church, 60 came from Christianity. So majority of the now nuns came from Christianity. Gen Z, it is projected that 53%, we have now hit the halfway mark, have no religious affiliation. We are now going in the United States into a completely post-Christian culture, and 53% of this new generation will have no religious affiliation. 65% of that came from the church. So it's only a 5% increase, but that's mainly, it's not necessarily good news, because in reality is more people are growing up without religious affiliation, so there's less people to even leave the church to become a nun. And so that's a statistic that freaks me out. I still have hope, but there is some reality is the assuming that they know Jesus is just not the case anymore. They are still, both of them are still open to spirituality and faith. They're willing to talk about spiritual matters. When it gets into organized religion, as what they would call it, the church, that's when we get into trouble, when we get into the weeds. But we'll talk about Jesus and spirituality all day long. And what's interesting is both generations view religious leaders as better role models than celebrities, politicians, and professional athletes. So there is some hope in that. Okay, so there's a quote here by Emery Wright that I kind of helps sets us up for this last section here. First, Gen Z, talking about Gen Z, they are lost. They are not simply living in and being shaped by a post-Christian culture context. They do not even have a memory of the gospel. The degree of spiritual illiteracy is simply stunning. So probably the most important factor that I've learned in my research is these three things on the new values of these two generations. One, experience is more trustworthy than words. And I even have a hard time grasping that or fully understanding that. So let me break it down as best I can. So having someone explain logically through data and research and historical documents or whatever else that something is true, trying to prove that, is not trustworthy enough compared to their own experiences on that very same thing. So what they experience, i.e. what they feel, determines the reality, determines what is true or what's not over heard facts. It doesn't mean that they don't completely believe heard facts, but their experience is the gatekeeper on what is true and what is not on convincing or logic or words. So the sermon in the church, that sermon is a little bit different because they hear it, but they don't, if they don't experience it, it's a disconnect. A great example is one of a 20-something that I talked about, and I think they kind of explain it the best way, is they don't want to just hear about the kingdom principles, as in the fruits of the spirits and all that, and spreading the gospel. They want to see the kingdom lived out in their everyday lives. They want to see where is it can live out in this world. So application is, they're desperately desiring application in sermons in that. They want to see, how can I experience it for myself, and then I'll believe it. And that affects everything else. That's why the flat earth theory, I apologize if you believe this, but logic, reasons, and facts say the earth is actually round, it's not flat. But that's actually true belief. Like some Gen Zs, a lot of them is starting to believe that the earth is flat because they can't experience a round earth. And it sounds ridiculous, I know, but that theory is becoming more and more popular in this, because it's all about, especially the explanation, is experiencing that. So number two, they're motivated by relationships, not position. So simply calling yourself a pastor or having the title of pastor or of leader or boss is no longer a strong influence. Just because you went to school and you got the degree and you took all the tests doesn't mean you're in authority. They listen to YouTubers who have no authority whatsoever, and they treat the same authority to those words as someone who has a degree. But they are motivated by relationships. So knowing the person builds trust, not what the person knows. So they want to have a relationship with that lead pastor, with that youth pastor, with that boss. Networking, who you know, is now the new priority in a value of leadership for Gen Z. A better leader is a better networker. Someone who networks is going to be held to a higher position in leadership of the future on that. Number three, they want to belong before they believe. We've heard this before with other webinars, and I'm sure you heard this before, it's actually a value now. It's something that is true for them. So they need to feel accepted first before they're going to believe in anything, even if that doesn't make sense. And so belief comes and goes because, again, truth is relative, but belonging is what can determine if I'm going to stick around, if I'm going to believe, if I'm going to do this. So here's what I've kind of coined as a new trend: test drive Christianity. What I'm seeing in especially older high school and into college age and now into upper 20s, because I work with age 12 all the way through 39 in my job, is especially in the 20s, they're test driving Christianity, which means for the most part they're experiencing faith just like a Christian would, but they don't really believe it. They're doing all the things that you would normally see as a Christian would, but they're really testing out to see if it works in the real world. So talking about becoming a member, that's I'll be baptized. Sure, I see other people baptized, I'll be baptized, but becoming a member, why? Church membership no longer equals connection to that church. Loyalty, you don't need loyalty because there's a million other churches. And if my friends or if I belong to another church, I'm going to go over there no matter how good this church is. Now, I'm not telling you that it's right. I'm saying it's reality. So they want to desire kingdom principles in real world situations. Does it work when I have conflict? Does it work when I'm deciding my career? Does kingdom principles work in the real world? Is the church making an impact in their community, or is it all just about coming and listening to a Bible study? They want more than that. And then they see Christianity as a virtue rather than a belief. That's one of the reasons why they're test driving it. So virtue is anything considered morally good or righteous. Christianity is good. It's important. It's good. But we don't know if it's true. And that's a belief, except that something is true or real. So you have Christians who are test driving Christianity, and Christianity is a virtue, but it's not necessarily a belief. And a belief is something, if it's true, I'm going to base my life now on it. Versus I'm just testing this out and I don't know. It's one of many options I have, kind of like choosing a college or choosing a career. So if you look at scripture, you can actually see in some areas that experience could actually lead to truth. Matthew 5:16 says this: in the same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see. Why? So that everyone will praise your heavenly Father. And that's a big thing. So that, not just for worshiping God, but so that everyone will praise, as in you want people to see it, experience it. John 13, a new command I give to you, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this love, by actually loving others, having other people see that love, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. That's a pretty big statement, by this love, in that. That also verse goes through accepting. 1 Peter 2, so this is not a gospel, but a New Testament letter. It says, be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors. Then, even if they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your honorable behavior, and they will give honor to God when he judges the world. So I'm not saying that we need to have, be fake or unreal on our living out our faith, but they need to see it in every area of our lives. So if truth is relative, what determines truth for these two generations? Their experiences, or my experiences, not our experiences, but my personal experience. If that doesn't work out, then my personal feelings. If that doesn't work out, my society. So the majority rules, mainly because experience and feelings don't really work. So society, the people has got to be right. So in the past, we have believe, then behave, then belong. That's our method in church. We evangelize. We get them then we get them into maybe a Bible study, or we get them baptized, or we focus on behavior. Here's how to pray. Here's how to read. And once they get to that, then they become a member of the church, or then they belong to the church. But these two generations are actually flipping it upside down. They want to experience all things in the belonging element that everyone else experiences in church, in belonging to church. Then they'll talk about behavior, then they'll believe. And it's different. It's drastically different. And it's also a struggle in how we teach and what we set up for ministry-wise, opportunity-wise, program-wise. This is the new reality because that's what they're looking for. If they don't feel they're going to belong, doesn't matter how good your worship is, doesn't matter how good your sermon is, doesn't matter how good of location your church sits in or even your business, they're not going to gravitate towards that. So finishing up here, so what should we do? Well, going back to the new reality, they're more like grapes, new harvesting. Here's what I would kind of summarize this now. This we'll dive in way deeper next week on this, but the 3 A's of the new harvest. And I just call them A's just because they're easy to remember for me. First, you got to accept. They should feel warmth, love, respect, and safety first before they even hear the gospel. And that sounds weird. That sounds wrong to me even. But the moment they exit their car, if you're at a church and you work at a church, the moment they exit the car until they leave, they need to feel that they're part of it. Do we create space in our churches for this new generation, millennials and Gen Z? They need to feel loved and respected. Now, here's the thing. That doesn't mean we have to agree with everything they do, but we don't do that with anyone else either. Someone comes in with a huge pornography addiction. They don't want to feel judged and okay, you need to deal with that before you can set foot in our worship service. No, but again, they don't even have to be loved. They don't even have to be respected. They just have to feel that they are, which is a catch-22, which means you can be a little bit more fake in the church and they can still experience it. But at the same time, they generally want to feel it, especially if you get caught and realize, well, this is actually fake. You don't really care in that. So they want to hear the gospel, but they are not going to do it unless they feel accepted on who they are first, and then they'll move into that. Next one is a Christian word, but it's abide. Now, corporately, it means staying close to Jesus, talking about Jesus, preaching on Jesus, focusing on what Jesus did application-wise, mission-wise, who Jesus is. Now, there's nothing wrong with the rest of the Bible. There's nothing wrong with the Old Testament. But millennials and Gen Z really gravitate to who Jesus is. He was real. He understood it. His world made sense to him. And so they can really gravitate to who Jesus is. And so the Anabaptist kind of flair that Men and Brethren has as well is a really good driving force for millennials. They're attracted to that, putting application to real-world experiences right away. So corporately, focusing on Jesus more and more is a good thing. Individually, our relationship with Jesus should endure and does not change. So our church didn't need to change because the culture changes or circumstances changes or emotions changes. We should be able to live every area of our life getting closer and closer to Jesus, abiding with Jesus and seeing what that looks like, and then being open with the struggles and the way we work with that. Last one is authenticity. I'm sure you're not surprised on this, but basically see us living out our faith every area of our life. Similar to abide, on our social media should match in person, our marriage, our conflict, in private. I had he's 21 now, but when he was 20, he stopped going to a church and started coming to our church because the social media account of that church had all kinds of pictures of helping the poor and taking care of the needy, but he never saw a person do that in the church. He said he never saw a person sign up for a program. He never saw them give money to the poor. So their social media account did not match up what the church did, and he literally left the church because of that. We need to speak with intellectual humility. We don't make gray things black and white or black and white things gray. And that's hard because sometimes we disagree on what is black and white and what is gray. But coming into saying, hey, I'm not a doctor, or hey, I'm not this, but here's what scripture says, and then let's have that discussion. That's okay. They fully believe that you believe that the Bible is real, but sometimes we think the Bible, we preach or teach or show that the Bible is real, and if the Bible is real, nothing else can be real. And that's a disconnect to that generation. The one thing we need to stop, though, is also a word, is alienating young people. We don't even know we do that sometimes. So this is an actual tweet. I'm not going to put the pastor's name on that, from a very prominent pastor. It is not an MB pastor in any way. So it's not from one of the Mennonite Brethren churches, but it's a prominent pastor. He says this angry generation, I think he's talking about millennials, but I don't know for sure, that says that they are going to start a movement should really learn to start a lawnmower first. Now, here's the thing. Doesn't matter if it's true or not. You are alienating an entire generation that will be 100% of the church in the future. So yeah, it's a good tweet. Yeah, it's funny. But it actually comes across as alienate them. So whether we realize it or not, we need to be very careful in criticizing and insulting young people in general. And so here's some other ways we do that. One, we alienate them by prevent them from key leadership roles. I've been part of churches where the discussion actually was, should we hire him because he was not married? He's not married yet. I don't know if he's yet. Marriage really, I heard this from an elder, marriage really helps mature a young man. And so that was something that I couldn't believe it, because I started ministry when I was not married yet either. We shouldn't be making age or hurdle. Sometimes some churches have, okay, you can't be 18 unless you to vote in the church. That's okay, but that is a form of alienating. Like, they're not waiting. A lot of young people are not waiting to 18 so they can vote in your church. So why make the age thing in the first place? But that's a whole nother subject. Focusing on generational weaknesses or lack of experience. Again, it's great material for jokes, and it's fun to kind of bash particularly the millennials. And not that they don't deserve it, but that helps you alienate them. Treating them like every other adult. So here's what's interesting. There is a catch-22. They want to be treated as adults, and yet they want to be treated differently than the other adults. So they think, believe, communicate, and want different things. So they want different things. If they're going to sign up for a ministry, if they're going to sign up for an event, they want to do it digitally. They want to do it on their phone right when you give that promotion. They don't want to go to a connect table afterwards. They don't want to visit some guy that they have to talk to just to sign up for a life group. They want to do it right now while you're talking about it. So we need to find that balance between catering to them and challenging them, because we can't just cater everything to them and throw everything we do out the window just so they could be happy, because that doesn't help anyone either. So you need to find that balance. And then becoming fake or inauthentic to try to attract them. Using keywords like we saw in the video, yeet and all that. No pastor should ever use the word yeet. It's not your word, it's their word, and they know it. And it just cracks me up, because I've done it as a joke, and there's just almost hostility of coming across as like, you can't use that. You don't even know what that means. No one knows what yeet means. But that's kind of a thing that they kind of see that. They want authenticity. So if you say, hey, I don't know about the social media, that's okay. They're willing to teach you. They're willing to come across, they know something more than you do, because they already believe that. So wrapping up here, we talked about this quote. The degree of spiritual illiteracy is simply stunning. So Emery White goes on with this. They are leaderless. Little, if any, direction is coming from their families, and even less is from their attempts to access guidance from the internet. So how can they be reached? They're leaderless. They're looking for something, and I really believe the church and Christianity could be that leader in moving forward in that. So next week we'll talk a little bit about some, not just Gen Z, but some characteristics in what they do or they're struggling with, particularly anxiety and depression, which is a huge thing that they're looking to the church for guidance with dealing with their anxiety and depression, because the internet, medication, and even professional psychiatrists are not working in their minds. So they're looking for what will work. And so, like I said, I highly recommend these resources if you get a chance. Most of them are online from Amazon. There's also several YouTube channels that you can get on that. So that's kind of my whole presentation. We're going to have a chance just to answer some questions. All right, there we go. Okay, so if you need to transition and you need to go somewhere, that's totally fine. But we're going to spend some moments answering any questions you might have. Again, I don't necessarily know all the answers, but I know I had a ton of answers when I was doing this research process. So, and some of them might only be able to be answered next week. You can still sign up next week if you haven't gotten it.
All right, so Kyle, one of the questions that came in was, does telecommuting change the moving towards the jobs, and how will this affect the job transitions? We have many moving there to the Pacific Northwest that are telecommuters. That was from when you were talking about the jobs, like on slide 13 or 14 or so.
Yeah. So all of this is fluid. Their genders are fluid, all that. So when they apply for a job, they're going to look at different websites, but they're also going to look at Facebook. They're also going to look at networking areas, social media. Facebook is becoming more and more popular for job descriptions. So if you're looking for a summer intern, you need to have a Facebook advertisement and pay to promote it, because they're looking in that. So are they changing? Yeah, it says that they're probably going to change on average 17 different careers, jobs in their lifetime. So I don't know the statistics on if they're actually moving from place to place, but from my limited research, I would say, yeah, they're moving from different areas. And if this job is more job security, more money, I'm willing to move my family there. And making sure grandparents stay in the home, or I need to stay close to my church or my family, is not as high value as it once was. I haven't read any of the comments, Russ, so if you want to just kind of.
Well, I think that's all the questions we had in the chat. So just want to appreciate everyone. If you do have a question, please throw it out there. I put in the chat my email address and Kyle's as well, that you can connect with us. So one other thing, I know many of you are familiar with Faith Front, and so I've asked Faith Front to they do their conferences, and they have an Elevate conference coming up in February. And I said, hey, is there any way that youth workers could get involved in a learning process of being able to know what it is that you're doing with these teenagers when you get them for a weekend? And so February 6th and 7th, Faith Front is going to be leading for us what we're calling Elevate Plus. So if any youth workers are interested in that and coming to see what, and it'll be directed towards youth worker training, but in a very similar format to what they do with the students the rest of that weekend. So that's a Thursday, Friday, and then the students come, I think, on Saturday and Sunday. And so if you're interested in that, shoot me an email, and we'd like to get that nailed down here pretty quick. So thank you very much.
I just saw one last thing, a comment on there, and I also reread that comment. Thanks, Russ, for that promo. But the telecommunications, I'm not in the stock market, whatnot, but if you want a stock tip, here's what I'm noticing: invest in hearing aids, because this generation will go deaf way faster than any other generation before, and telecommunications. So the coding, like as in digital coding, you're building websites and whatnot, that's the new factory worker for this new generation. So if you have a student, or if you have a child and you're looking for, I don't know what career I should go into coding, you're guaranteed a job on that. So I think that's also a factor in moving forward. That another one I saw is public versus private. So here's what's interesting: millennials are very public. They want to be known for it. They want to be the YouTube channel superstars and social media. So they are friends with everyone. Gen Z is public, but only digitally. So they might not be a YouTube channel, but they'll be very selective with maybe the social media platform they're on, and so they'll be very public in that one social media platform. So it's kind of a catch-22. They are not experienced they're not getting their driver's license at age 14, 15, or 16 because they don't need to. They can get everything they want from the cell phone, and what they can't get, their parents will drive them to. So they're experiencing the world publicly, but only in a digital sense in that. So that's why the catch-22 is. Final thoughts, questions before we kind of wrap up?
from a parenting perspective, this stuff is hard.
Yeah.
trying to parent, and like you made the comment that it's they operate from the process of what we like rather than where we come from.
Yep.
And when you're parenting from a, hey, this is who we are,
yeah.
and this is, it doesn't always go that direction. And when you're struggling with who your kids are becoming, and I think that's been a part of every generation, but there just seems to be a lot of stuff that comes up, and yeah, when they answer yeet or whatever, and you're like, what? No, tell me what's your answer?
This is the answer.
So yeah, so
That's
parenting is pretty crazy.
Yep. And so we'll get into a little bit about how to utilize social media next week, and what they do, because they have multiple accounts, one for their goofy self and one for their serious professional self. And so we'll talk all about that next week.
Here's one other question that just came in. How does reading the Bible digitally affect our brains as opposed to reading a printed hard copy? It's an important question for us as people of the book.
Yeah. Here's what's fascinating. We have the Bible in all different kinds of versions, more readily available and more easy to read, and devotions that are set up for us and remind us and everything else, and yet we're becoming more biblically illiterate as a society. That seems that seems completely countercultural to logic to me. If it's readily available, it's more powerful, more available, yet they're reading it less and less. I don't know about how does it affect the brain. I'm sure it does, but what I do know is students in my world are not even opening their Bible, their printed Bible, but they will open their phone. They'll open their Bible on their phone, and sometimes we don't even teach that. And so we used to have many years ago, put your phones away, don't be distracted. But here's the thing, they weren't reading the Bible then. So now we actually encourage them, and we actually take time. Okay, everyone open your phones, open the Bible app, and we remind them, hey, here's what the Bible app is. It's free, and get them on that, because they need the skill sets of reading the Bible on their own, not just at church. But the Bible app, it is probably one of the best things I've seen for the Christian community, because it has devotions, it has accountability. You can now do devotions with groups. So several of our small group with students are doing a devotional plan, and you can see progress through the Bible app, and it's totally free. We don't even have to provide the content, which is really nice. But yeah, it probably is affecting the brains. I don't really know how that works for a hard copy versus that. But again, the Bible is not an authority as it once does. So describing us as people of the book is not a good thing to them, because you're people of a document that I don't believe is true. Well, so how do we go from there? So maybe that phrase might have to change. I don't know. That's not what we're here for. But that's the new reality. Yep. I think that falling in love with the Bible and having them read and see for themselves how the Bible can apply to their lives is a crucial trait that we need to have maybe more intentionality in the church for. So that's it.
Good job. Appreciate it.
All right. Here, we'll end with one last question, and then we'll close it with this. Any advice on creating a connected youth group?
Yeah, that's hard. I would say a church, a life group ministry, adult small groups, a youth group, whatever. If you can prioritize that assimilation process, that connecting where people feel welcomed and accepted the moment they come in, all other hurdles are smaller. All other hurdles of getting them baptized and discipled and all that, believe me, you're going to have a much easier time, and they're going to be way better attended if they feel they're accepted and loved and connected in that. So some of it is culture. for our small groups, we always have an empty chair when we meet in our small groups for our senior high ministry. And that empty chair represents the friend we have yet to bring. So it's a physical reminder of, okay, we're not all here. Yes, everyone on the roster is here, but the moment we feel we're all here is the moment we now start thinking inwardly rather than outwardly of saying, okay, who else is not here? It's not necessarily the person we are forgetting or they don't show up or they're sick. We send out text messages and make them feel welcome. The other thing is we surprise them when they enter in. So we have all of our high schoolers kind of check in using a digital pad, and then we give them some kind of Swedish fish candy. Just say, hey, come on in, enjoy it. We bribe them just to check in, and you'd be surprised. Oh, that's different. You surprise them in your greeting, welcoming. The Walmart greeting where we open a door for them is not enough. And so they want to feel, how do I get connected? And so that we can get into a long thing, but a lot of it is just culture. It's adult leaders sending postcards or text messages. It's connecting. But sometimes, in my experience, the biggest hurdle is we don't even create space for new people to come and feel connected because we know everyone and everyone's here. The moment we have that feeling that everyone's here is the moment we're now inwardly focused. But yeah, I'll email you if you have more questions on that. I think they could go into a whole nother hour on that.
All right. Well, great. Well, thanks so much, Kyle, for leading us in this and your presentation. Thank you to all of you that have been attending. Appreciate you. Appreciate your comments and your love for youth and the next generations, or the generations that are not next. Here they are.
Yeah.
So don't forget about that. That was kind of the slap in the face that they're already out of college. Generation Z is already potentially the early ones that could be out of college. So yeah, well, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for attending. And let me just pray us out. Lord, we love you. We praise you. We thank you for all that you have in store for us. May you just guide us and direct us as we just put these students, these adults, these people that you have created in a place of prominence in our attention, Lord, that as we try to figure out our culture, where it is, where it's going, how to reach people with your message, Lord, just lead us and guide us in that. Teach us, counsel us. Lord, I thank you for Kyle and for the others here that can just help us in that. May you be honored and glorified, Lord, in all that we do, our words, our thoughts, our actions. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
And
all right. Blessings to y'all.